The last few tutorials, we've been looking at the object inside another object scenario. We've explored a couple of scenarios there, with one object being the entity and the object inside the entity being a value type. We saw how we could use Hibernate to save those objects if it was just one instance of the entity, one instance of the value type inside the entity. And we also looked at what if there was a collection of value type objects inside the entity. So in this tutorial, we're going to take it a step further again, and in this time, we're going to look at what happens if there is an entity inside another entity. So this is what we've done so far. We have a user details entity. Then inside that, we have an element collection of address. So address is not an entity; it's a value type, and we have looked at how to use Hibernate to persist this entity if this address was just a single instance, and also if it were a collection. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at something slightly different. It's very similar to what we've done for value types, but there are a few differences, so we'll have to make a note of that. So the first thing that we're going to see is an entity inside another entity. There's going to be just one instance, and it'll just be one entity inside another entity. And what we're going to look at in this tutorial is a one-to-one mapping. So this is the one-to-one mapping is a very common term that we use when we are designing databases. We look at relationships between tables, and we see what kind of relationship it is. We have one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, which is actually an inverse of one-to-many, and of course the third one is many-to-many. So in this scenario, we're going to look at one-to-one. Now, let me just remove the address portion here because we want to keep things simple. We have a user details class, and it has only two properties. One is the username, and one is the user ID. The user ID is auto-generated value because I've given this generated value annotation here, and the username is populated by the code. So I will also remove some code from the main method here, which instantiates the address. So the main method is a simple user details declaration, setting the first name, and then using Hibernate to save this this object that we have here. Now I'll create one more entity class, and I'll have a one-to-one mapping between the user details and that entity class. I'll just take a simple example. I'll just have say a vehicle class, and we'll have a one-to-one mapping between this user object here and the vehicle object. We'll assume for now that we live in a world where one person can have only one person can own only one vehicle, and we'll see how we can expand on having a one-to-many relationship later. But for this tutorial, we'll have a one-to-one mapping between user and vehicle. Now let me save these here. Okay, now I'll go ahead and create a new model class. So that's nothing but a simple class in the DTO package. I'll call this vehicle. Finish, and private int vehicle ID. And a string vehicle name. Again, we'll keep this simple. Just like we had an ID and a name for a user, we'll have an ID and a name for the vehicle as well. So now I'll generate the getters and setters for these two. Okay, now in order to make this, let me move this back up here. Okay, so in order to make this as an entity, I need to have an entity annotation here. At entity, again, this is same as what we did for the user details. So the at entity tells that this class is an entity class, and then on top of the ID, I will have a at ID, And I'll also have add generated value so that Hibernate will generate the primary key for us. So I'll import these annotations from javax.persistence. Okay, now that we have the entity class here, one more thing we need to do is to go to the hibernate.cfg.xml, and here we have the list of entity classes, so we need to add this vehicle entity class here as well. So I'll create a new mapping here, and we need to tell Hibernate that even this is an entity class that it needs to look at and persist. So I'll save this. Now we have this new entity class, and we have marked it as an entity class in Hibernate XML as well. So here I can instantiate this new entity class. So I can say vehicle equals new vehicle. Now I'll import set vehicle name as, just call this car. Okay, so now I can save this vehicle object also. So just like I do a session.save of user, I'll do a session.save of vehicle. Now, so far, I have not done any mapping here. Vehicle is an independent object. User is an independent object. There's no relation between the user and the vehicle. Now let's run this and see what happens. I'll just run as Java application. Okay, so here you can see it's done an insert to user details table, it's done an insert to vehicle table. The vehicle table is something that's created newly now. The user details table has username and user ID. The vehicle table has vehicle name and vehicle ID. So these two are two independent entities with no relation to each other. So you can have n number of entities, as any number of entities as you want. You just have to mark them as entities, and then if you do a session.save of objects of that entity, it's going to create tables and then insert them. Now the question is, what happens if we establish a relation? Now I want to establish a one-to-one relation between the user details class and the vehicle class. So in order to do that, what I'll do is I will have an instance of the vehicle class in the user details class. So I'll have a private vehicle and I'll create getters and setters for these. Okay, now we saw this in the earlier tutorial. If it were just a value type, okay, if this was just a value type, we could have had at embedded and an at embeddable, and what would have happened is the vehicle columns would have come inside the user detail table. So the user details table would have had a vehicle ID and a vehicle name column, but that's not the case here. Here, a vehicle is a separate entity. It needs a separate table. Now, obviously, we will have to have a mapping between the user details and the vehicle table. So the way Hibernate does it is by having a column in the user details table to point to the vehicle table. I'll show you how that's done. So when mapping entities, we need to use a different set of annotations depending on the relation that we have. Here we are trying to establish a one-to-one relationship. So we use the annotation at one-to-one and save. This is all it needs. This is all that we require to provide for Hibernate. Now the only other thing we need to do is to associate this vehicle with this user. So I have these two entities here. So all I need to do is I need to say user dot set vehicle as vehicle, so that there is a mapping between the two. Now what happens if we run this? User details has this column here called vehicle underscore vehicle ID. So this is a new column that's come up, and this column maps to the vehicle ID of this vehicle table. So what's happening is it's inserting the user record into the user details table, it's inserting the vehicle record to the vehicle table, but now what it's actually doing is in the user details table it has a reference to the vehicle ID here, and whatever record, whatever primary key it has generated for this vehicle ID, it will insert over here. Of course, in this case, we are using the auto generation keys for Hibernate to get the primary keys. But say we are not using this, what would happen is you would not know that what is the primary key of the vehicle unless the insertion is made. So that's the reason why it inserts the user details without the vehicle ID in place, and then it inserts the vehicle details with, and then it figures out what the vehicle ID is. Now it goes back to the user details and it updates the relationship by mentioning that the vehicle underscore vehicle ID should be this vehicle ID, so that this user is mapped to this vehicle using this vehicle ID link. Now this is actually the very basic way. We have not done a lot of configuration here, but most of the configuration that we've already seen already applies to this one-to-one. Say for example, let's say I want to change the name of this this column. Instead of vehicle underscore vehicle ID, I want to make this just vehicle underscore ID, say. So I would use that join column and name equals, I would pass the name here vehicle underscore ID. Now if I save and run this, there you see vehicle underscore ID is what is the the link here. So I'm controlling what the join column should be so that it's at a it's using a more readable format.